Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Magical Middle, Tales of Wonder and Realism. My name is Claire Quaintance, and I will be your moderator. Today, we have four authors who have written four books that fall right into that magical sweet spot, middle grade, and they've made them all more than a little bit magical for good measure. It's my pleasure to be speaking today with Andrea Beatriz Arango, No Place on Earth, with Random House Children's Books, between the bison who want to kill him, the geysers that want to melt him, his parents' separation, Gustavo is having a moment. And he keeps like stepping into someone else's dreams. Anna James, Alice with a Y, from Penguin Young Readers. Living with her grandmother in the shadow of World War I, Alice is invited to a most unusual tea party. Kate O'Shaughnessy with Brittle Magic from Random House Children's Books. To be a Brittle is to be magical in Lester Shiloh. And Christopher Roubique with Mythspeaker from Penguin Young Readers. Kaita knows that he is destined to save the world. Sometimes destiny just needs a little push to get going. So I'm so excited to talk to all of you today. I'd actually like to start with Anna about Alice with a Y. So you did this really interesting thing where you're basically writing as two authors. So you're having your own author voice, but you're also writing in the style of Lewis Carroll. And there were these moments where it were just like laugh out loud, absurd, funny. And then you had these quiet beats that I had to like put the book down. Like there's this one moment where Alice is offered a handkerchief and she thinks, I'm not crying. And then she realizes she is, that I just had to be like, okay, I'm taking a minute. And I'm really curious how you did this. Like, how did you match your author voice to Carol's while still maintaining your own so distinctively?
Thank you. That's really kind. It was quite the puzzle. Um, I live in North London. I'm very lucky to have lots of green spaces. I did a lot of wandering around the woods near me, listening to nonsense poetry, both Lewis Carroll, but also Edward Lear, Spike Milligan, like just like trying to get that nonsense kind of cadence into my brain. I also relied very heavily on a book called The Annotated Alice by Martin Gardner, which basically goes through the original book with extensive footnotes, kind of explaining all the references. I think that often we think of the nonsense as being really just kind of silly and not rooted in anything, but everything is a reference to something. It's just that a lot of those references have fallen out of our cultural understanding. They're like politics, art, things that were happening in the time that we just have fallen out of historical sort of familiarity. And that really unlocked something for me. I'm going to say this badly, but Hilary Mantel she says it beautifully, but basically think about how writing is putting as much interesting stuff into your head as possible and then kind of trusting what comes out. And I think that that really held true for trying to capture Wonderland. I really wanted all of the references and jokes and nonsense to be rooted in real things, whether that's the sillier side of things in nursery rhymes and idioms or the more serious political, historical stuff. It's set just after the end of the war. And then also just quickly, the other thing was the original is an amazing book. And was incredible, but I don't think anyone would mind me saying it doesn't really have a traditional plot. You know, it's a series of vignettes, like she wakes up at the end from a dream. So I really wanted to kind of stitch that with what we understand a children's book to be today and what I enjoy writing and give it that kind of emotional arc over the top whilst honoring that rhythm of vignettes and a character stumbling from scene to scene. So I kind of want it to feel like an Anna James story set in Lewis Carroll's Wonderland. That's kind of the balance I was going for.
I think you definitely hit it because, yes,
Thank
I've read the Lewis Carroll books, and you are right. It's a little bit of a fever dream, but this very
you.
clearly was like fever dream that is going somewhere.
All right, I'm glad that's a fever dream that's going somewhere is like my perfect response to it, I think.
My next question is for Christopher and Andrea. So, both of your books feature male protagonists, and they're facing real external challenges, but they're also facing the internal ones. And the internal ones I found to be really hard. So, Gustavo is battling both his own anxiety and like he's been dealing with it for a while, but also he's made this big move and he has this real fear that his friends have left him behind. And Kaita is hyper focused on his destiny. He knows he is meant to do something big. He's kind of focused on it to the point where he's afraid that if he doesn't do it, then he's just this kid who has kind of isolated himself. So, with everything we've been reading and hearing about male loneliness and the rise of some really toxic places online that feed into it, curious what role you see books as playing in talking to boys about the importance of being vulnerable, emotionally open with each other, especially at this age. Can we hear from Christopher first, please?
Absolutely. And that's a great question. I mean, it's a thing I've thought about a lot. There was a point in school for me where not a day went by that I wasn't hit or insulted or put down over years. And the funniest, saddest thing about that, in a way, is that the kids acting that way, that's what they thought they were supposed to do. For boys, a lot of the time it's, I need to be strong. I need to show that I'm strong. How do I show I'm strong? I enforce that strength over someone else. And that's why it was so important to me that Kaita, we never actually see him fight anyone. He never punches anyone. He never uses a weapon, actually, in the whole book. His literal gift is the gift of understanding. The thing he does better than anyone else is he can communicate. And that's something that I've really been conscious of in writing the book, talking about it, and just in other books I've written with boy protagonists. It's this thing of, how do we show boys that they don't have to be alone, that they don't have to be strong by themselves? A lot of the time, books can do it in this really beautiful way, because ultimately it is understanding, it is communicating. And while when we pick up a book, it is this really private moment where it's you, it's a book, you just get to have that sort of communion with each other. Having read that book opens you up to the possibility of connecting with anyone else who's read it, or anyone else who has identified with any part of what that book is about. And that's, to me, I mean, that's how you overcome male loneliness. It's how you overcome toxic masculinity. It's realizing you're not alone, that you can communicate with anyone you would like to if you're willing to try, if you can be brave enough to try. And what's stronger than that?
Thank you. It was beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Andrea, same question, please.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. And I think talking about mental health is so hard just in general, right? I think as a society, we have normalized those conversations a little bit more when we talk about adults, but there's still this stigma when it comes to children. And we're the ones making that stigma worse, right? Like us as adults, because we constantly minimize the experiences that young people go through and we make them feel like those diagnoses that they might have aren't as earned, as the ones that an adult might have. And so I think when you kind of narrow that down and look at boys specifically, and especially then get into like different heritages, for example, like Latinx heritage, there's all these cultural and gendered and often religious things that can come into play in addition to everything else. And it can get pretty toxic. And, I live in Puerto Rico, so obviously I'm coming at this from a Puerto Rican perspective specifically. And I love my island, but it can be a very toxic place to push back on gender expectations and the roles that people feel like you have to play. And especially when it comes to boys, like feeling their feelings or, showing any kind of softness, whether to themselves or with other people, it can be really hard. And so, what I'm trying to do in the book, and really in all of my books, because mental health is a very common theme for me in my writing, but specifically in this book, is kind of show how we can have those conversations, how kids can have those conversations with other kids and peers in their life, but also with the adults who might be the ones giving them those toxic messages, about boyhood in the first place. So yeah, it's same as you said, Christopher. It's just giving people who might not have examples of how to have those conversations in their real life, an opportunity to at least see how it can happen in a book and maybe take something from that.
Yeah, and I
Love
just
that.
wanted to, oh, sorry. I just wanted to say, I have had my own life journey with anxiety, and there's a moment in your author's note at the end of No Place on Earth where you talk about like one of your goals, and I'm super paraphrasing, but it's, giving words, the names, the understanding of what kids might be feeling to kids who've never had the opportunity to even just hear those words before. And I have gotten the opportunity in life to have that conversation with someone where I'm like, it sounds like you're experiencing anxiety, and seeing that moment on their face, like, I don't know what you mean. And so like your goal of doing that with this book, it's really beautiful and it's really well done. And it's very important, especially for boys. So thank you.
Thank you.
So Kate, I have a question for you about brittle magic. So loved reading Shiloh's voice. A, it was super refreshing. She is very clearly the main character of her story. She's very strong. She's also deeply flawed in a way that I loved. So she's jealous of her brother. She gets impatient with her sister. She can be a little manipulative, and she is not always the nicest to the people around her. Like she's going through it, and she is not, a fully formed adult. She's still a kid.
Hmm.
Curious how you go about writing a protagonist where your audience identifies with them, but also they're kind of imperfect.
I love this question. My favorite character, I would say, in middle grade is Ada from The War That Saved My Life. For anyone that's read it, she is stubborn, defensive, very prickly, resistant to things, just a flawed character, a very flawed character. Obviously, the circumstances of these two characters, right? Ada is a traumatized child during World War II with an abusive mother. Shiloh has a pretty happy family unit living in the Berkshires of Massachusetts in the modern day. So clearly different circumstances. But I think there's something that unites them, not these two in particular, but just the idea of these two flawed characters, right? Which is that, and I think as a reader, what I always relate to the most is the more flawed these characters are, the more human they feel to me. I think that flaws make a character more relatable to me as a reader than perfection or, being kind in a situation where you think you might be upset or you might feel jealous. And I think what I also think often is what kid hasn't been jealous or dealt with social comparison or anger. And so for me, because to be human is to be so flawed, that creates the strongest connection for me as a reader. And so I try to make sure that my characters do, especially my protagonists have these flaws. And I think as sort of a moment of hope, and not to give too much away about the story, but Shiloh is capable of one of the biggest acts of sort of grace and big-heartedness in the story, despite these flaws. And I think that's kind of a celebration of people in that we are not perfect. Nobody is. And yet look at what we can be capable of. So yeah, I love a flawed character. And it's funny, the two characters I had the most fun writing and felt the most sort of connected to and still do are Shiloh in this story and then my character Mo in Lasagna Means I Love You, both of whom I think have their flaws are very front and center. So take from that what you will.
Loved her flaws. There's a scene where her brother is like trying to kind of like connect back with her. And she has this moment of basically just like, no. And I loved it so much because it felt so real of just like, I can recognize some part of my brain is saying I should recognize I had a part in this, but also, no, I'm still mad at you. And I don't feel like being the bigger person yet.
100%. And as a reader, you kind of are like, well, obviously you're in the wrong, but she's so guided by that in the moment that she just couldn't even imagine. And I think about silly disagreements I get in with my husband. For sure am like that sometimes. And I have to kind of crawl back and be like, oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't let it go yet. So yeah, it's just I wanted it to have that feeling of realness and she's not going to make the right decision all the time. So
Love that. My next question is for Anna and Christopher. So, something I really loved about both of your novels is that both Alice and Kaita have these really supportive adults in their lives. Alice may not always understand her grandmother, and she mostly thinks that she's like making this whole Wonderland thing up. But at the end, Alice, your grandmother, is genuinely glad that her granddaughter has gone on this journey. She's like, you were meant to go do this. This is your journey. I'm proud of you. And Kaita's father, who is balancing like a lot, genuinely believes in his son, wants to empower him, wants to give him the skills and the experience to make his place in the world. Was there an adult in your own life when you were that age that influenced these portrayals? And if there's anything that you haven't maybe gotten to say to them that you'd like to, would you want to do it now that you're coming out with these great novels? Let's hear from Anna first, if that's okay.
Um, I think it's a really interesting perspective. And I know that we might come on to talking about parents and like the presence or absence of responsible adults. And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves in the conversation, but it obviously overlaps and it's something I grapple with lots. For me, in terms of thinking more about the real people rather than before we get onto the fictional parents, my granddad is in all of my books in some ways. He was integral to my relationship with reading growing up. And yeah, I think he always like they had a pin board in their kitchen and would pin up my stories on his pin board. And whenever we went to stay with my grandparents, there was like always a book on my pillow, and they had an independent bookshop near them that he would report back what I liked, what I didn't like, and the indie bookseller would help like matchmake this child that she rarely met with the new books. And he bought me so many of the books that were so formative to me, and he was so supportive of my writing from when I was a child. So I think he's really, and he passed away very suddenly when I was a teenager. And so I think that he's really present in all my books, my debut series, Pages and Co, till he lives with her grandparents. And I feel like my granddad's still there recommending books to people through Pages and Co. And grief is a big theme in Alice with a Y, and that definitely factored into that as well. So really, I mean, I don't know if how the rest of you feel. I feel like you sometimes don't realize the things you're circling until you write, and then you're like, oh, all my books, they're about different things, but they're all actually about the same thing. So yeah, that a lot of my books kind of cycle back to my granddad and those adults you have in your life who really put you on a certain path that you don't necessarily recognize at the time is a really important path.
Thank you. Christopher, same question, please.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you have an amazing sound, or had an amazing sounding grandpa, and I'm jealous. But also, right in that same space, it's funny the way that stories you write, you don't always realize you're in what way you're writing them for yourself. I keep doing that where I'll finish a book and be like, that was a beautiful story about like this one. This is a really great story. It's a high fantasy heist. I'm really happy with it. Oh, and it's also about, facing loneliness and realizing you don't need to go through life alone. And for me, like the two kind of the sides of the coin of parentage with this, on the one hand, my mom has always been incredibly supportive of me. She's literally said since I was a little boy that I should write books. And I said, no, mom, I couldn't write a book. That's not what a thing I would ever do. I legitimately did not try meaningfully writing a book until after I graduated college. And no one has been more just, oh, really? You're published now. Oh, than her. She is so proud and has always been so supportive of me, even when she was right and I was very much wrong. But on the other hand, and I might mention this a bit in the author's note for Mythspeaker, my biological father and I never had a good relationship. That's just not something I ever got to experience with him. And it was very much a conscious choice in Mythspeaker. And we might talk more about parents later, so I won't get too in the weeds on it. But originally, in the first draft of the book, Kaita's mom and dad were in the book, at least a little. And it was this thing where when I was talking with my agent Melanie about it, it was like, it's bogging it down too much. It's slowing it down to do the thing. Like, do we need to get rid of one of the parents? And it was this very conscious choice of, I want him to have a good dad. I want to show that because that so often doesn't get shown enough. And I know what it feels like to see it in books or not see it in books when you're looking for it. And so it was really important for me to reflect both this thing, a lot of the way his dad cares for Kaita is how my mom cared for me, the kind of support she always gave me, even if she didn't understand exactly why I was trying to do the goal I was trying to do. But it's also just aspirational, like the dad I would like to be, the dad I hope all dads try to be, you know. So yeah.
Love that. And I think that goes back to our earlier talk about toxic masculinity. Like you're showing a positive father-son relationship.
Yeah, like I said, you don't always realize it until you finish it, and then you go, "Oh my gosh, look, there's more themes than I thought." And then people will come up to you and be like, "I really love what you did with this through line of that." And you get to say, "Yes, I did that totally on purpose. Thank you for noticing."
That was the grand design all along. So Andrea, I'd love to talk about No Place on Earth because you did something incredibly interesting and I think really difficult, which is you wrote the novel half in verse and half in narrative, but it wasn't even like you just had one character who was all the way in verse. Like at some points it was Cordell, at some points it was Gustavo, at one point it's a bison. And you like did this really fascinatingly and really seamlessly. So I'm curious, How did you approach this? Did you write each chapter chronologically? Did you do kind of one version and then the other? And was one more challenging or easier than the other to write?
So originally, this novel was actually supposed to be fully in narrative prose. If you've read my other books, you're familiar with my work, you know that my previous three novels are all in verse. And verse isn't everyone's cup of tea. Like even myself personally, pre-publication, everything I wrote was in just regular narrative prose. It just so happened that the book that got me my book deal was a book in verse. And then I just kind of kept going with it. But there's so many different kinds of stories I want to tell, and I didn't want to limit myself to just one label and being known as just a verse novelist. And so I told myself this book was going to be 100% in prose. And then I started writing it, and well, I think the complication was that I also decided to write two POVs for the first time because all my other books have just been one. And so when I started writing it, I was surprised to find that Gustavo's voice came very naturally to me in that prose, but I just couldn't find a way to have Cordel's voice flow as smoothly until I gave in and tried writing his sections in verse. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, I found this character's voice. And then that also then became that stylistic distinction in the book where all the scenes where the characters are awake are in prose and all of the scenes where they are dreaming are in verse. But it wasn't originally supposed to be that way. I just kind of floundered my way into it because that's what worked when I was writing the book. I did, as far as actually writing it, I did write it chronologically. I am a chronological writer. I don't think I'll ever be able to move away from that. I'm a heavy outliner and then I write everything in order. I did during the revision make a point to kind of read the sections separately to make sure that the prose sounded like Gustavo and the verse sounded like Cordell. But I did write it all chronologically. And I think, it is the hardest book that I've written so far. And I think partly it's because I was trying these new things. Like I had to write so many more descriptions than I normally do, because I had to write so many more words than I usually do. I was halfway through writing this book and I was like, I should be done by now. Why are we only halfway through? So it was a challenging book to write just because I was trying lots of new things. But I like challenging myself. I think it really worked for this particular story and these characters. And I'm really proud of how it came out. But yeah, it was kind of an experiment, and I didn't have it all planned out this way when I originally started working on it.
Now that the experiment's done, do you think you would do a similar book in the same kind of way?
Yeah, well, I'm working on a middle grade now that was also supposed to be 100% in prose. Something in me just doesn't let me step away fully from the verse. So I think my next book might also be a bit of a mix. We'll see. We'll see where the writing takes me. If I'm meant to just always have a little verse in there, then it'll happen. But yeah, I just like trying new things.
Love it. Christopher, my next question is for you. So, while Mythspeaker is a work of fiction, it's inspired by real Indigenous myths and histories, which played into the city setting, Takida the trickster, and a couple of other elements. I'd love to hear more about what role real world myths, histories, and stories played as you were writing Mythspeaker. And I'm also curious if there is maybe a particular myth or story that you would love to see written or write yourself for a middle grade audience.
Absolutely. And that's a really great question. It's really fun to talk about. It was very important to me going into this book that I wanted to both make sure that it was a work of fiction, that everything was something I was creating for this book, um, but also that it felt authentic to, the indigenous folklore and mythology and history that goes along with it. And it's so fascinating because there's so many things that people who've grown up in the United States their whole lives don't realize happened like under their feet, or stories that have been here for hundreds or in thousands of years, that are so beautiful and fascinating. And so, little things like you said, Takida the trickster, who is this fundamentally kind of a being of chaos. A story about him is at the heart of Mythspeaker, and it's this sort of guiding tale Kaita uses to figure out how to go on a heist, because Takeda did one a long time ago. At least that's so the story says. And it was very much me looking for the right kind of character and knowing I needed a figure who was a little duplicitous, a figure who you couldn't quite ever read what they were doing. And there was this paper, it was a doctoral essay I read that was written back in the 50s, and it was just about how indigenous mythology handles the idea of paradox better than a lot of, quote unquote, Western mythology does. That indigenous peoples are often more on board, more accepting of the idea that something can be both very friendly to you and very dangerous to you at the same time. And to me, that instantly made a ton of sense. And it's like, that's the energy I need from this, from this character. But at the same time, it's not all mythological figures. Like the core setting of Mythspeaker, there are two cities. One is a city of the colonizers, New Column, and the other is Tlaratana, which is indigenous mound city that was very much inspired by Cahokia, which was a real indigenous mound city that was in what is now like the southern part of Illinois. And 1,000 years ago, it was bigger than London. It was bigger than Paris. It was this massive settlement of people that over the 100 or 200 years after that kind of disappeared. And the mounds are still there. You can go see them. It's awesome. But I wanted to celebrate sort of indigenous achievement, even just the idea that here is a city that is built on a democracy of tribes. Is very much a real thing that happened in the US with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which was a group of tribes that came together and decided to form a peaceful union. This is like the East Coast sort of region. And they even had a Bill of Rights that helped inspire the US Bill of Rights. And it's these things that people don't realize. And so one of the best responses I've gotten to Mythspeaker so far is, I know all of this is fiction. I know, this is just a story you made, but it let me sort of get a step in with my kid to talk about like the real history of things and the real cultures of things. And that's all I can ever hope for. As far as what myth I would love to see told in a book. Okay, so there's one that automatically like instantly comes to mind because I think it's perfect, especially like in the Riordan Presents kind of style. I don't think I'm the right person to write it. I will put that out there. But there is a story in Cherokee folklore. It's actually technically it's like the middle of a longer story about Nsei the gambler. But it's about a boy who he has a skin condition. He has these like lesions or sores on his skin that are really painful and they won't go away. And he goes to his mom and says, I can't stand this. What can I do? And she says, well, your father is thunder, like the actual incarnation of the natural element thunder. He is a great healer. Go see him. And so the boy goes on a journey and he gets to his father, and his father has sort of like quietly is testing to make sure, is my son actually, for lack of a better word, a demigod? Does he actually fit these characteristics? And the son passes them all. And then there is a last test where Thunder's other sons, who are also Thunder, are basically going to fight the boy. And if he is not strong enough, it won't end well. And Thunder's wife says to the boy at the heart of all of this, if you feel like this is getting too hard for you, threaten to strike this tree that Thunder loves, and he will stop the fight. And it's kind of in the moment, I was just reading this and thinking about this, like, but why? Well, it's because when he threatens to stop the tree, Thunder, the father, realizes that this is his son, Lightning. And if Lightning strikes the tree will die. And so this whole time, it's like, that's a really cool reveal. I would love to read this really exciting book about a kid who realizes at the end of the book that he's the incarnation of lightning. That sounds amazing. So if anyone wants to write that and send it to me, just let me know. I would love to read that just personally.
I want to read that too. Please send it to me when they send it to you. So my next question is for Kate and Anna. So both Alice and Shiloh are moving in the wake of grief. And we talked a little bit about how grief is very present in Alice with a Y. So Alice's father has died. And you have this great line about how the war ends basically right after he dies, which makes sense to Alice because why would anything else keep happening while he's gone? And Shiloh's in this family where her older brother has gone, and it's kind of like this black hole, like everything is being sucked in, everything is circling this. but it's invisible. It's like this trauma that they're all dealing with in their own ways that kind of informs their lives. Curious about what informs the way you approached your portrayals of grief in these novels. If we could talk to Kate first, that'd be awesome.
Sure. I absolutely loved the way that you phrased this question. How, right, because her older brother has passed away before Shiloh was born, and it is this cataclysmic event that is shaping the future of her family. And it is this black hole off screen that has, the gravitational pull is just extraordinary. And I think what has informed my own, the portrayal of grief in this story is my own grief, like what I've gone through. I think the idea of, life and death and losing somebody that you love, for me is my biggest fear, right? Like losing the people that I love. And it's also the fear puts into stark, contrast what is most important in life, right? When you really boil everything down to its core meaning, what matters. And I feel like loss and grief really shine that spotlight. And so for me in my work, I want to look at things like the basic human condition and these things that have meaning. And I think that having life and death as things that I look at in my work has always felt very important to me for that reason, because I feel like they're the two sides of the coin that really show you what matters. And it can show you how dealing with it poorly can really change your life for the worst, or by really understanding this idea that, people that you love will die can help you focus on things that you might not have sort of the power or strength to see without that awareness. So yeah, I think it always kind of finds its way into my work in some way. I wrote a book. My second novel, Lasagna Means I Love You, is told from the perspective of a girl who was raised by her grandmother who then passes away, and it's her sort of grappling with the loss of her grandma through the story. So I just feel this pull towards it. It was important to me to put into this book for that reason.
Thank you. Anna, same question, please.
Yeah, I think, I've obviously mentioned that my granddad had a big impact on me, but I actually lost all of my grandparents when I was a relatively young person. So that definitely like has its impact. But I think the other thing that really, when I'm fortunate to have published several books, which means I've done a lot of school visits, and you meet so many children who are going through just everything. And many of those experiences aren't for me to sort of write about, but some of them are so universal. And I think grief is one of those. And I think this speaks to what Andrea and Christopher were talking about as well earlier in terms of, I think fiction for me, I don't want to like te teach children something, but I think that fiction has such an incredible opportunity to help young people put words to things that they are already feeling, already questioning, but haven't quite got the language to put to those feelings. And you meet young people who've lost people all the time when you meet a lot of young people through your work. And I hope that the book helps them put some words to some of their feelings. No, it's not a universal, it's a universal but not universal, isn't it? But I also think one of the biggest ways I've betrayed Lewis Carroll is that, the characters in Wonderland really are quite actively unhelpful to the original Alice most of the time. Like they kind of they're either neutral or they're actively unhelpful. And I broke the Wonderland rules because as I don't want to do any spoilers, but there's a pretty clear metaphor, I would say, with a character that she meets in Wonderland for her dad. And on her way home, she meets a lot of the characters again, and they help her, which, yeah, I guess to say goes against the Wonderland Carol's Wonderland principles. But it was really important to me to put those little moments, those bright spots in of those people who, when you feel like you don't know how to move forward, when you've lost a real guiding force in your life, there are always people who can help you just take the next step. Like sometimes it's just about taking that next step. You don't have to know how to do the whole journey, but there's always people who will help you take that next step.
Thank you. I loved how both of you addressed grief in your books for exactly this reason. It's messy. It's not, here's the roadmap of like, this is when you'll feel better. This is what you need to do. And I think, especially for kids, I can see that really resonating with them of just like, it's messy, it's complicated, it's going to be a step-by-step thing, and it's going to feel different for every single person. Folks, it's time for our first group question. I know you've all been very excited and waiting for this. So you've all written 4 amazing books, and I'm really curious what books you read as a young adult that influenced your point of view as an author, and maybe even directly influenced your creation of this book, and if there are any callbacks in your books to any of them. Let's start with Andrea, please.
Okay, so my answer to this is twofold because I read a lot as a kid. I mean, I still read a lot as an adult, but I read as a lot as a kid, and this book specifically is really inspired but by what I couldn't find as a kid, in that I, like my main character, have always had chronic nightmares. And when I was a kid, I never saw, I would sometimes find books where people had like night terrors or it was like a PTSD thing, but I just couldn't find, I didn't know anybody who had as many nightmares as me. And growing up, what my family would always like joke around with, they'd say, oh, it's because you're so creative. Because I always like to write, right? And to read. And it really wasn't until I was a full-blown adult and seeing a therapist for the first time that my therapist was like, oh, do you think this might be a product of your anxiety? And I was like, what? And so I spent my whole childhood not even realizing that the two things were connected. Well, I didn't know I had anxiety as a child, but you know, those two things were very connected, and they're still very connected in my life. And so there wasn't like a direct inspiration for this book because it's the book that I wish I had when I was younger. But in terms of like a book or an author that has fully like truly had a humongous impact on my work, is definitely The Poet X, which I read in 2018. That was the very first book I ever read in verse. And that is literally what changed my trajectory as a writer and what got me published, because I read that book and I thought it was the coolest thing I had ever seen. I had always written poetry and I had always written stories, but completely separate. And if I had not read The Poet X, I would have never realized that books could be written in verse, and I wouldn't have wanted to try that like stylistically for myself. And then that book ended up being the one that got me the publishing deal. And not just that, but she was also the first author I read who shared so much of her culture and her language in her writing. You know, she is Dominican. And so for me as Puerto Rican, seeing such a similar culture just so profoundly in a book, it just rewired my brain. And I don't think Ivelisse Explains It All, which is my first book, would have ever happened if I had not read that. So shout out to Elizabeth Acevedo. I've never met her, but she has had a huge impact on my work. But I do always have callbacks to other books I've enjoyed in my books, even if they weren't inspiration. So Gustavo, in this book in particular, he likes to read graphic novels. And so in the book, he reads Mexikid and Gamerville. But yeah, I'm always giving book recs in my books because I love to read so much. But yeah, this was a weird combo of like, it was inspired by the absence.
Love that. Christopher, you're up.
Yeah, so a little similarly, it's Mythspeaker isn't inspired by just one thing. I love Easter eggs in like shows and movies and books. So legitimately, I started a page in, I have a journal that I write in for every book to like world build and make notes. And I have a page in my one for Mythspeaker that's just me trying to keep track of how many little like nods I've made to things. And then I lost count somewhere in the middle and I didn't want to start over. So I don't even know. But for me, the two kind of ones that jump to mind, the book that kind of changed my life, the series that kind of changed my life, I was in the 5th grade, and a Scholastic book order came through. For those of you who like the paper ones where the paper's really thin, I still dream very fondly of those. And there was a book in it called Broken Sky. It was a fantasy book by an author named Chris Wooding. And it just kind of showed me like fantasy can be a lot bigger than you think. It can be a lot more unique than you think. And in the second book in that series, there's a character who, to me, I don't think he was intended to necessarily, but to me, he felt very native coded. He felt like a native character among a bunch of characters who weren't, and I thought he was the coolest. Like it was just such an awesome thing to see this little, what felt to me like a piece of myself in the series that I loved so much. And his whole thing is he is very, very good with knives. And for those of you who have read Mythspeaker, there is a character who is very, very good with knives. And I don't know how intentionally I did that, but to me, it's very much like an homage to his name is the character's name in Broken Sky is Taka, to him. And then also, I'm a very big fan of C.S. Lewis. The Magician's Nephew is one of my favorite books of all time. There is a giant lion on the cover of my book, and I would be remiss if I did not say like Aslan factored some small amount into that. He's actually more inspired by the Stratford lion, but the idea of a giant ferocious thing that can also be much more than it seems was a huge inspiration for this book because it reflected really, really well with the idea that the world is a huge ferocious thing, but it can also be more beautiful and kind than it seems.
I love that. The world is a huge, ferocious thing. I kind of want that on a like that's a coffee mug right
I would wear
there.
that on a shirt, actually.
Yeah, I
Get
like
back to me.
that.
I might get shirts.
Okay, cool. Kate, you're up.
Um, so I was a big fantasy reader as a kid. I mainly read fantasy, which is exciting for me since this is my first book with a bit of magic. My previous three have been contemporary, which I also read. As I got older, contemporary started to be a little bit more exciting. So I think it's the way I feel always as a writer is that I'm just standing on the shoulders of giants. I feel that every book I read and love informs me in some way and shows me what's possible. Some have just knocked me over to the point where I'm like, I can't believe you can do that, you know? And so I think pretty much every beloved book I read somehow gets its way. I take a tool or I think to myself, wow, look at what they did, and it informs me in some way. But for a specific call out that I think speaks to my work from fantasy through my contemporary is there is a series that I read as a teenager by an author. Her name is Megan McCafferty, and it's called. It came out when I was a teen. They're called the Jessica Darling series, and it was total slice of life, really silly, crushes and friend problems and all this. And I remember finishing the sequel. I think it's called like Second Helpings or something, and just sobbing that my time with the characters was done. And it made me realize how vital it is to connect with characters and what an impact it can have on a reader. And that's something that I try to carry through, regardless of whether there's magic or it's straight contemporary, is that feeling if you really focus on your characters, you can have that impact, even if it's just a normal day in high school, like she does in the Jessica Darling series. So I'd say that I think back to, and I haven't actually reread it since I was a teenager. I'm almost scared to like have an impact on that sort of foundational experience as a teen reader and as a kid reader. So probably that just as a
That. Hannah, same question, please.
So all apart from Alice with the Why, my other books are more kind of like traditional fantasy, for want of a better word, with like magic schools and more like overt magic as opposed to Wonderland magic. And my first series, Pages of Code, is about a little girl who lives in a bookshop and travel inside of other books. So, like Andrea said, like that is just full of book recommendations because it's a book about books. So that one, there's very explicit call outs in that. And then my other fantasy series that I'm writing at the moment, The Chronicles of Weatherwide, that's really rooted, like Kate, I was a big and am a huge fantasy reader. Like to I'm such a Tolkien nerd, but my kind of big two are probably Ursula Le Guin and Diana Wynne Jones. And actually, I love The Magician's Nephew as well. I read that of the series, and I feel like I'm always chasing that moment at the end of The Magician's Nephew when you realize that like the tree in his garden is what the wardrobe is built out of. Like it blew my tiny brain. And the Weatherwise series has big time jumps in it, and that directly came from that experience of so enjoying seeing how a world was pieced together. and getting to kind of jump in on it at different times and see how it's developing. And then Alice is kind of a funny one because obviously it's like Alice in Wonderland. Like, there's like a one big call out to the book that it's directly in conversation with. And it has a lot of references to individual poems that I was very specific with. None of the references, they're all contemporary or earlier with when the book is set in 1919. So all the references to poetry and other books they had to exist when My Alice existed. But two of the books that had a big impact on kind of my approach to it were The Phantom Tollbooth and James Thurber's books as well. Like just that real delight in word play. Like The Phantom Tollbooth, it was one of those books I read when I was younger, and again, like just that, oh, you can do that. Like Kate says, like I didn't know you could do a book like that. I didn't know I could read a book like that. And I think just that utter delight in words really had a big impact. When I do school visits, we come up with nonsense words together and their definitions, and I just love hearing what kids come up with. And I think just that sense of play in words and language is so innate to us as humans. And if you ask an adult, will come up with a word, they're like, "Ugh, I don't know. What do you mean come up with a word? Like you can't." And the kids are just like, "Yes, cool, great, I'm on it. Here is this new word, and here is what it means." And so that kind of love of just words being fun is really, yeah, I think Phantom Tollbooth really was the kind of seed of that.
Love that. Thank you. So we're coming to the end of our time, but I have one more question for Andrea and Kate, actually. So both of your books play really lovingly into magical realism, which is one of my favorite things. I think especially for a middle grade audience, this idea of like our world, but like with a little bit more magic than you're actually seeing is really powerful. So when you're writing a piece like No Place on Earth or like Brittle Magic, how do you go about creating the rules for your magical system, like where magic starts and where reality ends? Did you come into the book knowing the limits, or did you kind of develop it as you're going? And let's start with Andrea, please.
Yeah, so same as Kate, this is my first book that is not like a strictly realistic contemporary kind of book. And so no, I had no idea what I was doing as I was writing it. But I also think dreams are so interesting because like as a society, we honestly know barely anything about dreams. It's so hard to study them and to study like the subconscious brain. And so I think this is one of those books where it really depends on the individual reader, whether they even consider my book to have magic at all, and whether they think dream Yellowstone and, the things that Gustavo and Cordell are doing while they're dreaming are magic or just like their regular life. Um, so yeah, I don't think I have very many specific rules. It's a lot of just going with the vibes, and if you think it's magic, then you can interpret it as such. And if you have had dream experiences that you cannot explain, then maybe you're gonna feel really seen and not consider it as magic. So I know a lot of people in my family have been able to do things that maybe to other people would seem kind of, like visions and stuff like that. I've had family members who've been able to do things like that, and they didn't see it as magic. It was just like, oh, one time I had this dream and it was definitely true, so I told you not to go do this and you didn't do it, and so that's kind of the approach that I was going for. And it'll be interesting, I think, once the book is out in the world, how people categorize it. Because I personally wouldn't categorize it as a fantasy, but I do think a lot of people are going to refer to it as having magical elements. So I'm curious to see how it is received, especially by young people and how they approach it.
Love that. All right, Kate, take us home.
So this book is very much soft magic. They talk about soft magic, medium, hard magic. There's only really, I've always loved the sort of family magic. That magic comes down this lineage, like in Savvy by Ingrid Law and Encanto, you've got these families with these magical traits. And I love that in movies and fiction. And it's even a source of confusion for Shiloh's own family. She talks about how her family gets together and they're all arguing about what the source of these little magical gifts that they all have. They don't know. And I really only have a couple of rules. The one rule I had, and just like Andrea was saying about dreams, I completely agree. The fact that dreams are a mystery to us and that we spend so much of our life in them is just fascinating to me. And so one of the only rules for this book in terms of the magical rules is the night before that you're born, your mother will dream what your talent is going to be. So it kind of puts this mother relationship kind of central. It has that lineage feeling, and the rest of it is just kind of like it just fades into mist. You know, it's the community kind of accepts that this is a different family, and you don't really have a sense that there's any magic going on elsewhere. It's just this family with these skills and this magic set in the real world. So both as just I love that. I love reading stories like that, watching movies like that. And yeah, I as a first go into fantasy, I wanted to do that sort of soft, foggy lens around it.
Thank you. Friends, somehow we are at the end of our time already. I think I have like 8 questions we didn't get to at all, and that's totally fine. That's how it rolls. I want to thank you all for being here, having this conversation with me. I want to thank everyone who's watching and sharing your time with us. So up next, you have 2 concurrent panels to choose from: fiction that resonates and the perfect crime. I hope you have fun and happy reading. Bye, everyone.